A poor hungry girl was crying on a bench. A millionaire lady went to help and was shocked. Margaret Donnelly, once a formidable figure in New York's social scene, now found herself wandering through the misty trails of Central Park. Her footsteps slow, deliberate. The air smelled of wet earth and forgotten promises. The scent that made the past feel closer than it had any right to be. She wasn't walking to get anywhere in particular. She hadn't been for years. These afternoon strolls had become a habit, a ritual in her solitude. And yet, today felt different. Today marked the 15th year since her daughter, Lila, had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a tattered journal and a wound that had never healed. As Margaret strolled beneath her black umbrella, her thoughts drifted until a distant figure caught her eye. A girl, barely in her 20s, sat alone on a drenched park bench, her hair plastered to her face, her feet bare against the cold pavement. Something in the girl sitting, her shoulders hunched in silent defeat, pulled Margaret out of her reverie. She hesitated, unsure whether to approach or leave this ghost-like figure to the shadows. But something, perhaps it was instinct or the aching space in her heart, urged her forward. What if today, of all days, she was meant to meet this girl? What if there was something more to this encounter than a fleeting moment of shared loneliness? Margaret took a breath, gripping the handle of her umbrella tighter, and stepped toward the girl, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. Margaret's steps were slow but steady as she approached the girl on the bench, her eyes narrowing to take in the fragile figure before her. The girl barely moved, except for the occasional shiver that rattled through her slight frame. She seemed unaware of the cold rain drenching her clothes or the quiet world surrounding her. Margaret couldn't help but feel a pang of recognition, something in how this girl carried herself. The weight of sorrow wrapped around her like a heavy cloak, reminded her too much of Lila. The closer Margaret got, the more she noticed the girl's distress. Her damp, tangled hair clung to her face. Her lips were pale, and her feet, bare against the wet ground, seemed almost blue from the cold. For a moment, Margaret hesitated. This girl, this stranger, could be anyone, and Margaret wasn't sure she was ready to confront the storm of emotions surging within her. But then the girl lifted her head slightly, and Margaret caught the faintest glimpse of her face. It was as if time stopped, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The resemblance to Lila was uncanny, too close, too real to be ignored. The same almond-shaped eyes, the same high cheekbones, even the same defiant slant of her jaw. Margaret blinked, wondering if her grief played tricks on her. But the pull to this girl grew stronger. "Are you all right?" Margaret's voice cracked as it left her lips, startling her as much as the girl, who turned her head toward the sound. The girl blinked, her gaze unfocused momentarily before her eyes met Margaret's. She looked lost, utterly alone, as if she had been wandering through the rain and life itself without a destination in sight. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice as fragile as her appearance. "I don't know what to do anymore." Margaret felt a pang in her chest at the girl's words, words that echoed a familiar pain. How many times had she whispered those words into the silence of her empty home after Lila had vanished? The helplessness and the feeling of drowning in the unknown were all too familiar. Without thinking, Margaret folded her umbrella and sat beside the girl, feeling the cold rain soak through her coat as the drops fell heavily on her. She didn't care. "You don't have to be alone," Margaret said softly, offering warmth even though the cold gnawed at her bones. The girl shivered again, wrapping her arms around her knees. Margaret could see that she was trembling, not just from the cold, but from something deeper buried in her soul. "I've lost everything," the girl whispered, her voice breaking. "My mother, she died a few months ago. Since then, I've had no one." Margaret's heart clenched at the girl's confession. She felt an overwhelming urge to comfort this young woman who seemed to drown in her. "What's your name?" Margaret asked gently, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile connection forming between them. For a long moment, the girl was silent, as though weighing whether she could trust this stranger who had so unexpectedly come into her life. Finally, she whispered, Rachel. Margaret nodded slowly, repeating the name in her mind. Rachel. It's such a simple, beautiful name. She reached out and gently touched the girl's shoulder, feeling the cold seep into her fingers. Rachel, she said softly, I can't leave you here like this. Come with me. We'll figure this out together. Rachel hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. But beneath that doubt, Margaret saw something else, a flicker of hope, faint and fragile. But there, I don't know, Rachel began, her voice shaky. I've been on my own for so long. You don't have to be alone anymore, Margaret said with quiet determination. Please, come with me. Rachel finally nodded, and Margaret helped her stand, steadying the young woman who seemed ready to collapse under the weight of her grief. Together, they strolled, making their way toward the edge of the park where Margaret's car was parked. The rain continued falling in relentless sheets, the sound a backdrop to the silent thoughts that filled Margaret's mind. As they neared the car, Margaret's eyes caught something glinting faintly beneath the collar of Rachel's wet jacket. It was a locket swinging gently on a delicate chain around Rachel's neck. Margaret's breath caught in her throat once more. It wasn't just any locket, it was the locket, the one she had given to Lila on her 18th birthday, only a few months before her daughter had disappeared. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, almost unconsciously, to touch the tiny gold heart hanging around Rachel's neck. Where did you get this? Margaret's voice was quiet, but the urgency in her tone made Rachel glance down at the locket. My mother gave it to me, Rachel said, her brows knitting together in confusion. She said it had been passed down in our family for years. Margaret's heart began to race. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was something more. She didn't say anything, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the locket as they reached the car. Could this girl be connected to Lila in some way? Could Rachel be? Margaret's hands trembled as she unlocked the car door, the question swirling in her mind almost too much to bear. She couldn't ask Rachel more, not now, not when the truth felt too fragile, too dangerous to confront. Instead, she focused on getting Rachel out of the rain into the warmth of her home, where they could talk more comfortably. Rachel climbed into the passenger seat, her small frame shivering in the warmth of the car. Margaret took a moment to gather her thoughts and steady her hands before starting the engine. She couldn't let Rachel know her suspicions. Not yet. The drive back to Margaret's house was quiet. The city lights blurred in the rain, and neither of them spoke. Margaret's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle that had just fallen into her lap. Could Rachel be Lila's daughter? Could this young woman sitting beside her be the answer to 15 years of unanswered questions? Margaret glanced at Rachel, who stared out the window, lost in her thoughts. There was something about this girl, something so hauntingly familiar that it stirred long-buried memories. But there was no turning back now. Margaret had to know the truth. When they arrived at Margaret's brownstone, Rachel looked up at the imposing building, her eyes widening slightly in awe. Margaret could see the unease in her expression and quickly reassured her. It's just a house. Rachel, you'll be safe here, she said, trying to hide her growing agitation. As they entered the home, Margaret led Rachel upstairs to a guest room that had been left unused for years. It seemed fitting now. A room that once waited for a guest who never came was offered to someone who might hold the key to everything. You can stay here as long as you need, Margaret said, fluffing the pillows on the bed, her voice tight with emotions she couldn't fully grasp. Rachel nodded slowly, her gratitude visible in the soft smile she offered. Thank you for everything. Margaret smiled back, though her mind was already elsewhere. There was too much left unsaid that still didn't add up. She would wait until tomorrow. Then, she would begin to ask the hard questions. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. The soft ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway marked the passing hours. But the questions in her mind refused to settle. Could Rachel truly be connected to Lila? Was the universe cruel enough to dangle this hope before her only to snatch it away again? She sat in her armchair by the window, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. Rain still beat against the glass, the same rain that had soaked them both in the park. Margaret stared at the empty streets, but her mind was far from the quiet suburban neighborhood. It was in the past, wandering through the painful memories of Lila's disappearance, the frantic calls, the sleepless nights, the endless search that led nowhere. And now, this girl had appeared, almost like a ghost from those memories. The resemblance was too much to ignore. And the locket was something Margaret could never forget. She had commissioned it for Lila's 18th birthday, a special gift with their family crest engraved on the back, one of a kind. It had disappeared with Lila all those years ago. Margaret set down her cup and stood, her heart heavy with thoughts she couldn't quiet. Tomorrow, she would begin to untangle the mystery. But tonight, she could only wait and hope that fate wasn't playing a cruel trick on her again. Morning came quietly, the storm having moved on in the early hours. Margaret moved through her morning routine with anticipation, her mind racing with thoughts of Rachel. She hadn't heard any movement from the guest room yet, so she let the girl sleep a little longer. When Rachel finally emerged, she looked hesitant, unsure of her place in this large, quiet home. Her hair, still slightly damp from the rain the night before, fell loosely around her shoulders. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that tugged at Margaret's heart. "Good morning," Margaret said, her voice calm and steady, though her mind was anything but. "Morning," Rachel replied, offering a faint smile. She looked around, taking in her surroundings for the first time in the light of day. The house was grand, but filled with the subtle melancholy of a place without much joy in recent years. Margaret gestured toward the kitchen. "Come, sit. I made breakfast. You must be hungry." Rachel nodded, and they sat at the kitchen table, where a simple but comforting meal awaited. Margaret poured coffee for both of them. Watching Rachel quietly sip frost up the silence between them was heavy, not with discomfort, but with unspoken questions. After a few moments, Margaret broke the quiet. "You mentioned yesterday that your mother gave you that locket," she said, trying to keep her voice casual though her heart was pounding. "Do you know much about its history?" Rachel looked down at the locket around her neck, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing its edges. "Not much," she admitted. "My mother didn't talk much about our family. We move a lot, and she always seemed guarded, like she was afraid of something." Margaret's breath caught. Afraid of something? The words struck her deeply. She had always wondered if Lila had been running from something, but she never found out what. Could it be that this fear had been passed down to Rachel? "I see," Margaret said softly, her mind racing. "And your father? Did she ever speak of him?" Rachel shook her head. "No, I never knew him. It was just the two of us. Always." Margaret's heart ached at the familiarity of Rachel's story. It was too close, too similar to Lila's, for it to be a mere coincidence. She glanced down at the locket again, her mind swirling with possibilities. Could Rachel be? The thought was too overwhelming to complete. Not yet. After breakfast, Margaret led Rachel to the living room, where they sat on the brown leather sofa, its cushions untouched by visitors for years. The house felt different with someone else in it, less empty, though the weight of the past still lingered in every corner. Margaret had lived here alone for so long, and now, with Rachel's presence, the house seemed to hold its breath. Margaret knew she had to tread carefully, but the questions pressing against her heart were too strong to ignore. She couldn't wait any longer. "Rachel," Margaret began, choosing her words with care. "You said your mother moved a lot. Did she ever tell you why?" Rachel hesitated, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Not really. She just said we had to keep moving and that it was safer. I never understood it, but she was always so protective, like she was hiding something." Margaret felt a surge of emotion. Hiding something? The echoes of Lila's final years played in her mind. Lila had become distant before she disappeared, secretive, as if she were protecting herself from a danger Margaret couldn't see. "What about your mother's past?" Margaret asked, her voice a little tighter now. "Did she ever talk about where she came from? Her family?" Rachel shook her head, biting her lip. "No, she always changed the subject when I asked. She would say it was too painful to talk about." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, her suspicions growing stronger with every word. She glanced down at the locket once more. It wasn't just the locket, it was everything. The way Rachel carried herself, the way she spoke, The stories of her mother that echoed too closely with Lila's. Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself for what she had to say next. Rachel, she began, her voice soft but firm. There's something I need to ask you. It's important, and it might sound strange, but I believe you may be connected to my daughter. Lila. Rachel's eyes widened in surprise. Your daughter? Margaret nodded, her heart racing. Yes, my daughter disappeared 15 years ago, and I haven't heard from her since. But the locket you're wearing, I gave it to her on her 18th birthday. And how you speak about your mother is too similar to be a coincidence. I need to know, is there any chance your mother could have been my Lila? Rachel stared at Margaret, her mind reeling. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too heavy. I don't know, Rachel stammered, her voice trembling. My mother never told me much about her past, but she always seemed scared of something, like we were running from someone or something. She never used her real name, at least not that I knew. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Not her real name. Could it be that Lila had changed her identity, running from something or someone she feared? Rachel looked down at the locket again, her fingers trembling as she held it. She told me this was important, Rachel said softly. She said it would protect me if anything happened to her. Margaret felt a wave of emotion rise, threatening to overwhelm her. Her daughter, her Lila, had been running, hiding, for all these years. But from what? Or from whom? I need to know the truth, Margaret said quietly, though her voice was laced with urgency. Rachel, we need to find out what really happened to your mother. If she was my Lila, I've spent 15 years searching for answers, and now that you're here, I feel we're close. But I need your help. Rachel nodded slowly, though the confusion and fear were evident in her eyes. I don't know much about her past, but I remember her saying someone was after us. She never told me who, but she was always watching, always afraid. Margaret's stomach churned at the thought. Someone had been after Lila, and possibly after Rachel, too. But who? And why? We'll figure it out, Margaret said, determination settling into her voice. But first, we need to learn everything we can about your mother's life before she disappeared. There must be something, anything, that can lead us to the truth. Rachel looked at Margaret, her eyes filled with fear and hope. Okay, she whispered. I'll tell you everything I know. Rachel began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the weight of the memories was too much to bear. We moved every few months, sometimes more often than that. My mother never explained why. She'd tell me to pack quickly, and we'd be gone by morning. We'd leave everything behind, friends, jobs, sometimes even our belongings. It was always like that until... Her voice trailed off, and Margaret leaned forward, urging her gently. Until what? Rachel? Rachel swallowed hard as if dredging up the past was physically painful. Until the night she disappeared, she said, her eyes filling with unshed tears. We were living in a small town in Oregon. Things had seemed normal for a while. Too normal, I guess. One night, she woke me up in a panic. She said we had to leave immediately. She shoved this locket into my hands and told me to find you if anything ever happened to her. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. Lila had been trying to protect her daughter. But from what? From whom? I didn't understand. Rachel continued, her voice cracking. I was so scared. But someone came to the house before we could leave. I never saw who it was, but I heard them arguing. My mother told me to hide. So I did. I stayed hidden. But then there was this gunshot. Rachel's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the locket. Margaret's blood ran cold. Gunshot. Rachel nodded, her voice trembling. I waited for hours before I came out. But when I did, she was gone. No sign of her. Just gone. Margaret felt the room spin around her. Her worst fears were being realized. Lila had been running from someone dangerous enough to take her away, leaving Rachel behind. But who? And why? Rachel, Margaret said softly, placing her hand over Rachel's trembling one. We're going to find out the truth. I promise you that. Margaret knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, professional help, Someone who could dig into the murky waters of the past and uncover the truth. Without hesitation, she reached for the phone and dialed the number of Richard Grant, her lawyer and longtime confidant. Richard had been with her through the worst years of her life, offering his unwavering support when Lila had disappeared. If anyone could help, it was him. Margaret. It's been a while. Richard's familiar voice greeted her, though his tone had a note of concern. What's going on? I need your help, Richard, Margaret said, her voice tight with emotion. I found someone, a young woman. She is Rachel, and I believe she might be Lila's daughter. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Lila's daughter? Richard echoed, the disbelief evident in his voice. Margaret, are you sure? I'm not sure of anything, Margaret admitted, her fingers gripping the phone tightly. But she's wearing the locket. Richard, the locket I gave Lila before she disappeared. And her story, it's too close to Lila's for it to be a coincidence. Another pause. This one longer. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice calm but serious. All right, Margaret, I'll look into it. I'll need as much information as you can give me about Rachel, about her mother. We'll start there. Margaret exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. Thank you, Richard. I don't know what else to do. I need to know if she's my granddaughter. You'll have answers soon. Richard promised. I'll get back to you as soon as I find something. Margaret hung up the phone and turned to Rachel, sitting quietly on the sofa, watching her with wide, anxious eyes. What did he say? Rachel asked, her voice soft but full of hope. He's going to help us, Margaret replied, her voice steadier now. We'll get to the bottom of this. Rachel, we'll find out what happened to your mother. Days they were passed, each one feeling more extended than the last as Margaret and Rachel waited for Richard to uncover the truth. Rachel remained quiet, spending her time in the house's many rooms, seemingly lost in thought. Margaret, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of a revelation that would change everything. Then, one morning, the phone rang. Margaret, Richard's voice was solemn. I found something. It's about Lila. Margaret's heart raced as she clutched the phone to her ear. Tell me, Lila didn't just disappear. Margaret, she was running from someone dangerous. I've traced records back to a man named Victor Langston. He's a criminal with a history of violence, and it appears he had been involved with Lila before she vanished. Victor Langston? Margaret's voice trembled. She had never heard the name, but its weight felt like a stone in her chest. Yes, and there's more, Richard continued. Rachel's mother, who I now believe was indeed Lila, used multiple aliases, moving from place to place, trying to stay one step ahead of Langston. But it seems he finally caught up with her the night she disappeared. Margaret's blood ran cold. And Rachel? Is she in danger? I don't know, Richard replied. But if Victor Langston is still out there, we must be cautious. This man is ruthless. And if he thinks Rachel knows anything about Lila's disappearance, Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. We'll be careful. Thank you, Richard. After she hung up, Margaret turned to Rachel, who had been listening closely to the conversation. It was him, Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. The man who came that night. It was Victor. Margaret's stomach twisted with fear. They had found the truth, but it wasn't the ending she had hoped for. The man who had taken Lila away was still out there, and Rachel might be his next target. As the reality of the situation settled in, Margaret knew she had a choice to make. She could live in fear, letting the shadows of the past dictate their future, or she could take control, protect Rachel, uncover the whole truth, and finally end the nightmare that had haunted them both for so long. Rachel, Margaret said, her voice firm with resolve. We need to ensure you're safe. I won't let Victor, or anyone else, harm you. But we need to face this head on. Rachel nodded, her face pale but determined. I don't want to run anymore, she said quietly. I've been running my whole life and am tired of it. I just want to know the truth, even if it's painful. Margaret smiled, though her heart ached for the girl who had been through so much. We'll do this together. You're not alone in this anymore. The next few days were filled with careful planning. Richard arranged for heightened security around the house and began working with authorities to track down Victor Langston. Margaret and Rachel prepared for whatever might come next, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one they had to walk together. And yet, despite the danger, Margaret felt something new blossoming inside her. Hope. After 15 long years of searching, wondering, and grieving, she found her granddaughter. And though the circumstances were far from ideal, Margaret knew they had been given a second chance. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret and Rachel grew closer, their bond deepening with each shared memory, each story about Lila. Slowly, the shadows of the past began to lift, replaced by the warmth of the present. One evening, as they sat in the garden together, watching the sunset, Rachel turned to Margaret and smiled. "I think my mother would be proud of us," she said softly. Margaret's heart swelled. "I think she would be, too," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "She would have loved to see how strong you've become." Rachel nodded, her eyes misty but filled with peace. "And I'm glad I found you." Margaret reached over and took Rachel's hand, her heart finally beginning to heal. "I'm glad I found you, too." Margaret Donnelly's journey, like so many others, began with a loss that never healed. For 15 years, she wandered through life with the weight of her daughter Lila's disappearance pressing down on her heart. But fate brought her a second chance through Rachel, a young woman carrying the scars of her complicated past. Together, they uncovered painful truths about Lila's life and the dangers she faced. But in doing so, they also found a path forward, one built on love, family, and the determination to stop running from their past. Rachel's discovery of her connection to Margaret and her mother's hidden life is a testament to our strength when we confront the unknown and seek the truth. No matter how painful, their bond, forged through shared grief and hope, reminds us that while the past may shape us, it doesn't have to define our future. If you've ever found yourself searching for answers or struggling with the weight of the past, Margaret and Rachel's story shows that healing is possible. You don't have to walk alone. Seek out the people who can support you, face your fears, and find your path to healing. For more stories like this that inspire, comfort, and encourage us all to face life's challenges with resilience, subscribe to Healing Story 66. Join our community as we explore potent tales of human strength, compassion, and hope within every struggle.